So my name is Shakthidharan. I came to Australia when I was about 3 years old. My mother and father are from Sri Lanka, and we were in Colombo before we left. And before Colombo, my family was from Jaffna. I've grown up in Australia and I have an Australian accent. And my friends in Sri Lanka tell me that I can be hard to understand with my accent. So I apologize in advance if some of my words don't make sense. In terms of what I think the migration experience is, I think of the word bittersweet. My grandmother came to Australia and did that at a time when the 1983 riots had just passed through Colombo and spread around the country. And I was a baby. And we came to Australia and she tried to deal with the separation from her homeland by bringing everything with her. She literally pulled together whatever she could to bring everything with her, including the kitchen sink and front doors of our house. And she built a house in Sydney, which is her attempt at rebuilding what we'd lost in Sri Lanka. And I always think of the word bittersweet because she was a very ferocious, passionate woman, like a lot of the women in our culture are, very determined. And she went further than anyone reasonably would in terms of trying to rebuild a feeling of Sri Lanka here in Sydney. But it's actually an impossible task. You can try and try and try, but it's not the same as being back in the homeland. And so that's why I think of bittersweet. No one wants to leave their homeland. And I think that gets forgotten a lot in Australia because of all the opportunities we have here, which are legitimate and real. Particularly economic opportunities, but many families like ours didn't come here for those. They came because they didn't feel safe somewhere else. And so the enjoyment one has in being slowly accepted into Australia is always balanced by a place that you've left that you didn't really want to. And I think of the generational differences. In a way, my grandmother could think like that and could keep her sense of herself and a big part of her heart in Sri Lanka because that's where she'd spent most of her life. For my mother's generation, it's really difficult because she came here in the prime of her life, really. And you spent half your life somewhere else in the homeland, and then you're going to spend the other half of your life somewhere new. And my mother dealt with that by burying that pain. And growing up, she didn't talk about Sri Lanka much. And that was how I grew up, without knowing much about our history. And at the time, because my mum, Amma, has a lot of qualities that other Sri Lankans and Sri Lankan Tamil Ammas have. She was very discipline focused, quite overprotective, and wanted me to study hard, etc. So growing up, I didn't realize the real reasons for not talking about our past. I just thought it was part of what Ammas do to make sure you get a good job and focus on your studies and don't do anything naughty. So that was how I took it. My mother is a classical Indian dancer, a Bharatanatyam dancer, and it was a really interesting mixed atmosphere to grow up in, because on the one hand, I was immersed in Tamil classical arts, you know, the stories, the music, the dance, as anyone who knows about our classical arts, that, you know, those things are not separated. So with the music and the dance comes our spirituality, our religion, a way of life, a way of thinking. So I was very privileged and lucky to have that all around me as a part of life. It's what I grew up in. And yet that was, at the same time as having that, that was balanced with no talk of the reality of actual life in Sri Lanka and our histories. I did not obey my mother's wishes, and instead of becoming a doctor or a lawyer, became an artist myself, which she was very upset about. And I write and direct theatre and film, and I'm a composer of music as well. And for a long time, my work in Australia focused on working with communities here that don't have a powerful voice. You probably know that Australia is a very multicultural country. Not just Sri Lankans, but people from countries all over the world, both countries that have been through war or other kinds of troubles, but also lots of countries from the West, you know, lots of British people here as well. People from all over the world have come and settled in Australia. But the kinds of stories we tell in our film and theatre industries still have a long way to go to mirror what Australian society is really like. And so I really invested myself in a lot of that work and helped other people tell their stories from different migrant communities, different Indigenous communities, you know, supporting these kinds of people to say what they wanted and try to have more power with their voice. And it wasn't until my late 20s that I realized that I couldn't go forward without knowing what was behind me, without my past. And I think it's something a lot of migrants go through, and children of migrants go through when they hit that period of their life. And because you don't really know who you are unless you know your past. And so I, for the first time, started turning the lens that I've been working with other communities to myself and my own community. And I began researching for a play called Counting and Cracking. And because I'd spent so long in my artistic practice working with people and communities, you know, it was very much about being out there with other people and listening to them, as opposed to sitting in my room by myself. I did the same thing for this. And I talked to dozens of Sri Lankans here, and eventually dozens of Sri Lankans around the world and in Sri Lanka as well, and asking them about my family's history, when it was members of my family, or the broader country's history and their experience. And it was a really varied group of people. It was people who'd come to Australia as asylum seekers and refugees who are trying to rebuild their lives and might work at the markets, you know, selling fruit, to being inside a cricket club in Colombo, talking to people who were close to ex-prime ministers of Sri Lanka, to women in Jaffna, who'd survived the war and were trying to rebuild their lives. And the thing that emerged for me was a picture of Sri Lanka that was really different to the history books and the way the media talk about the country. It showed me a picture of what the politics of division can do to a country when leaders try to divide people for political gain, and the disastrous consequences that can flow from that. And it showed me the differences between rich and poor in Sri Lanka that were as important and strong as differences between cultures. And overall, I felt like there were so many quiet Sri Lankan voices that we don't hear enough from in the national discourse or the diaspora discourse. And I had a duty to make those voices louder by giving them space on stage, and for their voices and stories to be heard. And during all this very confronting and overwhelming multi-year experience of just listening to people, to hundreds of people in the end, I went back to Sri Lanka for the first time, and my mum, Amma, was still saying that this was a very stupid thing to do. And so I went back against her wishes, and I have family in Sri Lanka, and I learned about, they took me in, and I remember sitting with one of my uncles and reading my great-grandfather's letters and learning about a man who had, at the beginning of his life, tried to fight for equality between Tamil and Sinhalese in Sri Lanka, and towards the end of his life had given up on that being possible. And I just found it incredible that the kinds of things that the children of migrants hear about, history, war, peace, if they just talk to their parents and their ancestors and their community members, they'll realize that these are not terms. These are the lives and experiences of their own family and the hidden stories behind their own parents. I sent the first draft of the play to Amma via email. And this is the amazing thing about the arts, because we never would have been able to talk about this stuff face to face over the dinner table. But she must have read it on her own, in her own time. And all the information and all the stuff I'd listened to was all bundled up in this draft of this play. And after she read it, she started talking about Sri Lanka for the first time. And this really amazing thing happened where the production started developing and going to rehearsals, and she became very involved and wouldn't stop talking about Sri Lanka. And two things happened. One, the play went from being, in its initial stages, the story of a family that had been broken apart because of the war in Sri Lanka and coming to Australia, kind of finding a way to accept that breaking apart and forging their own lives in Australia. It changed into a play in which they found a way to reunite in Australia and reconnect to their history. And that's because the stuff that my mother started to say ended up in later drafts of the play. And so the act of her reading it and responding actually changed what the play was. And it became something different because of the effect it had on her. And it helped her heal her relationship with the homeland. And the understanding I came to was that she never wanted to leave Sri Lanka. She missed it every day. And that time in 83, and this is so true for many of the other people who've left Sri Lanka at different times in its history, was a particular time. And, you know, I always remember her saying that maybe if they just stayed for a few more weeks, they might never have left, you know. And I think about what I would have become in Sri Lanka. Like, I'm quite an activist here in Australia, and we were able to criticize the government, and we can put that into our work. And the situation is not as simple over there. And I wonder what my life would have been like where you are. And I feel like there is a job for the children of migrants in being the ones who reconnect and reconcile and find a way to go back to where their parents or their grandparents left. And before coronavirus hit, everything's different now. Amma was talking about spending part of her life back in Sri Lanka, which would have been an unthinkable thought when I was growing up, and is testament to what, you know, things like a play can do, the arts can do. And she hasn't asked me to get proper work since then either. I think she finally feels I have a legitimate job. So there's a real act there, I think, you know, just to recap with my grandmother's generation, they know who they are. You know, they're Sri Lankans, and they live out the end of their lives here, and they try to keep a hold of what they can. Whereas my mother's generation had to figure out a way to literally be split in half, you know, and at first had to push away their past and then find a way to revisit that and embrace it again. Whereas my generation's job is to, you know, confront the question of how the diaspora can be a useful and supportive and presence for Sri Lankans, and to have a meaningful relationship with Sri Lanka, which is embedded with communities over there. So that's kind of been my journey with both the play and my thinking around the various generations of my family and migration. I've done a few works now and with the Sri Lankan community. So that play, Counting and Cracking, was an epic, and not an epic by Asian standards. I know our temple festivals over there go for a week, 12 hours a day. But by Australian standards, it was an epic. It was a 3.5-hour show that had 16 actors. Those actors were from across the world. You know, Anthony Dusson was in it from Paris. There were Sri Lankan actors in it. There were actors, Sri Lankans from New Zealand, you know, in it. And so it was an act of bringing diaspora and Sri Lankans together. And it really examined the build up to the civil war in Sri Lanka and why we as a country were not able to avoid it, and what a family has to do to reunite. But I've done really different types of projects. Another one we call The Other Journey was outdoors, and I had interviewed these parents and children about their experiences of leaving the Vanni and Jaffna and raising their children in Australia. And they were very, very informal interviews. They were like, had the kind of quality of when you talk to someone you're close to, like a family member or a friend, all through the night. And I assembled bits of these interviews, and myself and collaborators here put music to them, and people listened to these stories on headphones outdoors on a riverbank. And the beginning of the show, we offered everyone to choose either cinnamon or chili. And depending on what they chose, they were broken into two groups. And one group actually got on a boat and went down the river away from the rest of us, and one stayed on the riverbank. And there were projections of Bharatanatyam dance and animations and bird sculptures and fire and the smell of cinnamon and jasmine. And it was, Counting and Cracking the play was on at Sydney Town Hall, a very big building here, and was about an audience gathering to struggle with and be present with the struggles of this family and through that family of a country. Whereas the other journey was an incredibly individual, personal experience where through these headphones, you would sit on a boat, basically in your own little private universe, and listen to the most vulnerable truths of these families, whispered into your ear. And so they achieve a different kind of experience and a different lens on the Sri Lanka migrant experience. Going into the future, I'm looking at a different kind of topic, which I think is equally important in a feature film, which is a story about a mother and son who are separated when the son is still a boy. And the son grows up in Australia and the mother stays in Sri Lanka. And I won't give away the plot, but what it explores is that the son in Australia follows this life of individualism. And he thinks that what he's going to do, the success he finds, is going to bring his mother to Australia. And the mother goes through a lot of heartache in Sri Lanka, but rebuilds her life on her own through the power of collectivism, through the power of women around her. And it's actually the son who ends up returning to Sri Lanka and learning from his mother. And I think it's really important to flip on its head these old ideas we have of the Western economic model and the Western model of success being the only ways to find success in this world, and that there are some incredible things happening post-war in Jaffna and in the Vanni in terms of how people are choosing to find a way to rebuild their lives through some of our old values around community and family and collective power that the rest of the world can learn from.